The USAF exchange officers at RAF Waddington in 1958 had a private nickname for the aircraft parked on the dispersals, the aluminium overcast. The Avro Vulcan's 111-foot delta wing looked to men trained on the swept lines of the B-47 Stratojet, like a piece of architecture that had wandered onto a runway. One American major, seconded to 83 Squadron, wrote home that the thing appeared to have been designed by a man who had never seen a fighter. The Vulcan flew at high subsonic speed at 50,000 feet, carried a single Blue Danube free-fall fission bomb, and depended on altitude the way a swimmer depends on breath. In the summer of 1958, that was still just about a doctrine. Bomber command in those years belonged to Air Chief Marshal Sir Harry Broadhurst, and its Bible was a Whitehall paper drafted in 1955 under Sir Anthony Eden's short government. The global strategy of massive nuclear retaliation, delivered by a triad of Valiant, Victor and Vulcan. The V-Force was Britain's independent deterrent, and it existed because Attlee's cabinet had decided in a small committee called GEN 163 on January 8, 1947, that Britain would build its own atomic bomb whatever Washington thought. Ernest Bevin's line at that meeting has been repeated so often it has become worn smooth. We've got to have this thing over here whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it. The V-bombers were the flying edge of Bevin's demand. At Waddington, at Scampton, at Coningsby and Honington, the crews trained for a war that would be flown at contrail height. Simulated attack profiles took them across the North Sea at 45,000 to 50,000 feet, releasing over the Baltic approaches, turning for home before the Yak-25s could climb to intercept. The American assessment, shared quietly at RAF Bomber Command's joint nuclear planning conferences with Strategic Air Command from 1958, was that the V-Force added useful mass to the Western Strike Plan, but was a generation behind the B-52. LeMay's men at SAC considered the Vulcan a handsome curiosity. The word most often used in the American mess anecdotes was quaint. Then on May 1, 1960, a Lockheed U-2 flown by Francis Gary Powers was hit by an SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile at 70,500 feet over Sverdlovsk. The aircraft came apart. Powers survived to be paraded in Moscow. The Air Ministry received the news through the Joint Intelligence Committee within 48 hours, and the implications were understood at once. The SA-2 Soviet designator S-75 Dvina could reach any altitude a V-bomber could reach, and it was being deployed in belts around every target of consequence in the Warsaw Pact. The entire high-level penetration doctrine on which £180 million of British aircraft procurement had been staked had been shot down with Powers. A JIC paper circulated in July 1960 concluded, in the flat prose the committee favoured, that the assumption of sanctuary at height can no longer be sustained. Sir Thomas Pike, Chief of the Air Staff, ordered the study that became the low-level conversion programme. The Vulcans and Victors would come down. They would fly at 250 feet above the North German plain, under the radar horizon, and they would deliver a weapon that could be tossed from that height without incinerating its own delivery aircraft. Everything about the airframes, the crews, the navigation kit and the bomb had been designed for the opposite regime. The Americans at Waddington kept their opinions to themselves and watched to see what the RAF would do with a strategic bomber that had suddenly been asked to become something else entirely. The conversion began in the autumn of 1963 and was substantially complete by the end of 1964. It was not tidy. The Vulcan B.2, built for thin air, now had to fly through the thick, turbulent layer where birds and pylons live, and the airframe complained. Fatigue meters bolted into the wing roots recorded stress cycles that the design office at Woodford had never expected to see. The white anti-flash paint that had covered the aircraft since 1958 was replaced from 1964 onwards, with a disruptive pattern of dark sea grey and dark green over the upper surfaces. The underside kept in gloss white for a while longer, then repainted matte. From a distance, the fleet looked as though it had been dragged through a wood. At Boscombe Down, the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment cleared the Vulcan for sustained flight at 250 feet. In some profiles, 100 feet at 350 knots indicated. Crews trained over the Welsh valleys, over the Scottish Highlands, along the low-level routes that came to be numbered LFA 7 and LFA 14. Handley Page's Victors, more elegant and structurally more delicate, took the strain worse. The fleet was progressively withdrawn from the primary strike role and converted to the tanker role from 1965. The Vulcan carried the burden. The weapon changed too. Blue Danube had been retired in 1962. Yellow Sun Mark II, with the Red Snow warhead of about 1.1 megatonnes, was in service, but it was a ballistic freefall bomb that assumed a level release at height. What the low-level force needed was a standoff weapon. The answer from 1963 was the WE.177B, a lay-down thermonuclear bomb of some 450 kilotons, retarded by parachute, fused to detonate after the delivery aircraft had cleared the blast radius. The maneuver was called LABS, the Low-Altitude Bombing System, and it was practiced at the Wainfleet Range on the Wash and the Derby Range off the Isle of Man. Skybolt should have been the elegant answer to all of this. The American air-launched ballistic missile, GAM-87, would have let the Vulcans stand off 1,000 miles from their targets. Harold Macmillan's government had bet the deterrent on it. On December 7, 1962, Robert McNamara cancelled the program. Macmillan flew to Nassau 11 days later, cornered President Kennedy at the conference from December 18th to 21st, and came away with Polaris. The Royal Navy would take over the strategic deterrent by 1969. Until then, and for the tactical role thereafter, the Vulcans would fly low and drop the WE-177 by hand. At High Wycombe, Bomber Command Headquarters ran the exercises that stress-tested all of this. Exercise Kinsman, Exercise Co-op, and from 1970 the annual SAC bombing and navigation competition at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where the RAF sent Vulcan crews to compete against the B-52 and FB-111 forces of Strategic Air Command. The Americans held the trophy. They had the fleet, the electronics, the practice. Then in 1974, the RAF crew of a Vulcan B-2 from 44 Squadron, flying against SAC's B-52s and FB-111s, won the Mathis Trophy for the best bombing results in the competition. They won the Navigation Trophy the same year. In 1977 and 1978, the Vulcans came back and did it again. The low-level conversion, forced on Bomber Command by an SA-2 over Sverdlovsk, had produced a force that could put a weapon on target under the radar with greater accuracy than the Americans could manage from any height. The aluminium overcast was now a low-level strike aircraft that beat the home team at their own competition. The Americans stopped making the joke about the design office. Whether the RAF could actually do the job in anger was a different question, and one that in the spring of 1982 the government would answer over the South Atlantic. The Argentine junta landed on the Falklands on April 2, 1982. By the evening of April 5th, the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Terence Lewin, had assembled a task force and was moving it south. The nearest usable British airfield to Port Stanley was Wide Awake on Ascension Island, 3,900 miles from the target. No RAF aircraft in the operational inventory had the range to fly there, bomb and return without refueling. The Vulcan, retired from the strategic role in 1969 and scheduled for withdrawal from the conventional role by the end of 1982, was the only aircraft that could carry a heavy load that far. The air officer commanding No. 1 Group at Bawtry, Air Vice Marshal Michael Knight, was asked on April 9th how quickly the Vulcan force could be prepared for a conventional strike at extreme range. The honest answer was that it could not. The refueling probes had been removed years earlier and the plumbing capped. The pilots had not practiced air-to-air refueling since the 1960s. The bomb bay was configured for the WE-177 and had no conventional weapon carriers fitted for a stick of 21 1,000-pound bombs. The inertial navigation system had never been intended for a 9,000-mile round trip over featureless ocean. Waddington got the job. 44, 50 and 101 squadrons pooled their least fatigued airframes. Engineers at RAF St. Athan and RAF Marham searched hangars, museums and scrapyards for the removed refueling probes. Some were reportedly recovered from a Vulcan Gate Guardian and from a museum display. The plumbing was rebuilt. The bomb carriers, designed in the 1950s for conventional operations that had never really been practiced, were fitted to 5 aircraft. 2 carousel inertial navigation units were borrowed from British Airways Vi C-10s and bolted into the cockpit alongside the existing kit. The target was the runway at Stanley, a 4,100-foot strip of pierced steel planking that the Argentine Air Force was using to stage Pucará ground attack aircraft and, if lengthened, might have taken Mirage 3 fighters within range of the task force. Denying the runway was a strategic requirement worth the effort of getting a Vulcan to it. Operation Black Buck 1 launched from Wideawake at 2350 Zulu on April 30th, 1982. The primary aircraft, XM598, developed a cabin pressurization fault on climb-out and returned. The reserve XM607, captained by Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers of 101 Squadron, took the mission. Behind him, 11 Victor K.2 tankers of 55 and 57 squadrons flew a refueling ballet across the South Atlantic that the RAF had never attempted at that scale. The plan required 17 individual refueling transfers to get 1 Vulcan to the target and home. Withers coasted in west of Stanley at 300 feet, pulled up to 10,000 feet for the bomb run to get the sticks above the airfield defences, and released 21 1,000-pound bombs across the runway at a shallow angle at 0446 Zulu on May 1st. 1 bomb hit the runway near the midpoint, cratering the strip. The others fell along the length of the airfield, damaging fuel installations and aircraft. He turned north, rendezvoused with a Victor for the long climb home, and landed back at Ascension at 1452 Zulu after 15 hours and 45 minutes in the air. At that point, the longest bombing mission in the history of air warfare. The crater was repaired within days. The strategic effect was elsewhere. The signal reached Buenos Aires the same morning. If the RAF could reach Stanley with a Vulcan, it could reach Comodoro Rivadavia, and it could reach the mainland bases at Rio Gallegos and Rio Grande, from which the Argentine Skyhawks and Super Etendards were flying. The Fuerza Aérea Argentina drew the conclusion Whitehall had wanted them to draw. Mirage 3 interceptors of Grupo 8 de Caza, which had been staging forward to harass the task force, were pulled back to defend the mainland. From that point on, the air defense of Argentina's northern cities took priority over offensive operations against the ships in San Carlos water. That was Black Buck 1. There were 6 more Vulcan sorties from Ascension between May 3rd and June 12th, 4 of which reached the target area. Black Buck 2, on the night of May 3rd to 4th, again attacked the Stanley runway. The bombing pattern fell wide. Black Buck 3 was cancelled for weather. Black Buck 4, on May 28th, was aborted mid-mission when a Victor tanker developed a hose fault. Black Buck 5 on May 31st and Black Buck 6 on June 3rd carried AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missiles, hastily integrated onto Vulcan underwing pylons that had been designed 20 years earlier for the never-deployed Skybolt. The Shrikes were fired against the Argentine TPS-43 and Skyguard radars at Stanley. XM597, captained by squadron leader Neil McDougall, took battle damage to its refueling probe on Black Buck 6 and diverted to Rio de Janeiro, where the crew were interned for a week before Brazilian authorities returned them and the aircraft. Black Buck 7 on June 12th was an airfield attack with airburst-fused 1,000-pound bombs. None of these later missions had the strategic weight of the first. Withers's raid on May 1st had done the political work by demonstrating that the geography of the South Atlantic no longer protected the mainland. At Northwood, in the underground headquarters from which Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse ran Operation Corporate, the Black Buck missions were understood as a bluff that had come off. The nuclear V-force, converted in the early 1960s for low-level penetration of Warsaw Pact defences, retasked in the 1970s for tactical strike in Central Europe, was being sent on 8,000-mile conventional round trips to hit a runway made of pierced steel planking. It worked because everyone involved refused to accept that it could not. The Prime Minister, in her flat at Downing Street on the morning of May 1st, was told the news by John Knott. Margaret Thatcher's private secretary, Sir John Coles, later recalled her reaction as quiet satisfaction rather than triumph. She asked how long the runway would remain unusable, and was told, honestly, not long. The strategic effect was what mattered, and Whitehall was clear about that from the start. Fleet Street was less measured. The Daily Express of May 3rd, 1982, ran the headline, "The Empire Strikes Back," over a photograph of a Vulcan on the Waddington dispersal. The Times, more soberly, called the raid a display of reach that the Argentine command will have understood in terms it cannot ignore. The BBC's 9 o'clock news on May 1st led with the statement issued by the Ministry of Defence at 1100. In the early hours of this morning, RAF Vulcan bombers attacked the airfield at Port Stanley. Ian MacDonald's voice reading the MOD statements in flat sentences from the podium in Whitehall became a fixture of the war. The Vulcan was retired on March 31st, 1984. The last of the V-Force had done a job that its designers had never imagined. The story that runs through this, from the Global Strategy paper of 1955 to Black Buck 1 in 1982, is not a story about an aircraft. It is a story about a Whitehall habit of mind. The willingness, when a doctrine collapses, to reconfigure hardware and men to a role for which they were not built, and to do so without asking whether it can be done. The Vulcan is the case study. There are others. Consider the deterrent itself. When Skybolt was cancelled by McNamara in December 1962 and Macmillan came back from Nassau with a promise of Polaris, the Royal Navy had no ballistic missile submarines, no experience of operating them, and no warhead designed for the American missile bus. The Chief of the Naval Staff, Admiral Sir Caspar John, was told in January 1963 that his service would take over the strategic deterrent within 6 years. The first Resolution-class boat, HMS Resolution, sailed on her first deterrent patrol from Faslane on June 15, 1968. The warhead, designed at the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston under Sir William Cooke, was the ET.317, later designated the Polaris A3T warhead, in British service. 4 boats, 16 missiles each, 3 warheads per missile after the Chevaline upgrade of 1982. From the Nassau Agreement of December 1962 to the first operational patrol of Resolution was 5.5 years. The Americans took longer with a larger industrial base. Chevaline itself, the upgrade program, was another instance of the same habit. The Polaris A3 warhead, as delivered by the Americans, was assessed by the Joint Intelligence Committee in the early 1970s as unlikely to penetrate the ABM defenses that the Soviets were building around Moscow under the Galosh program. The Wilson government commissioned a study in 1973. Callahan's government approved the full program in 1975 under the codename Chevaline. The cost, when it was finally admitted to Parliament by Francis Pym on January 24, 1980, was £1,000 million, a figure that had been kept off the parliamentary estimates for 7 years under both Labour and Conservative governments. Chevaline was a British-designed penetration aid package developed at Aldermaston and Farnborough that replaced the 3 warheads on each Polaris missile with 2 warheads and a set of decoys, chaff and manoeuvring bus. It was a technical achievement of the first rank. It was also a demonstration that when the Americans would not provide what Britain needed, Britain would build it in secret and pay whatever it cost. The habit shows up in intelligence too. When the JIC concluded in 1976 on the basis of Oleg Penkovsky's material from the early 1960s and later product from GCHQ's Cheltenham decrypts, that the Soviet civil defense program implied a war-fighting rather than a war-deterring doctrine in Moscow, the response of the Callahan government was not to adjust the deterrent downward, but to commission Chevaline. When Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB colonel in London running for MI6 from 1974, reported in the winter of 1983 that the Politburo genuinely believed NATO's Able Archer exercise might be the cover for a first strike, the response was to feed his warning through Charles Powell in Downing Street to the White House, and to modify the exercise scenario. The habit was to take the intelligence seriously and to act on it. None of this was cheap. The question that hung over the whole period was whether it was worth it. Dennis Healey, as Defense Secretary from 1964 to 1970, spent 5 years trying to answer that question in public. His 1966 Defense Review announced the withdrawal of British forces from east of Suez by 1971. The withdrawal was accelerated by the sterling devaluation of November 18, 1967, and confirmed in January 1968. Aden was evacuated on November 29, 1967. The Persian Gulf commitments were wound up by December 1971. The commitment to Malaysia and Singapore ended in 1976. In 8 years, Britain shed a global military posture that had taken 2 centuries to construct. What remained was the North Atlantic and Central European commitment. The British Army of the Rhine, headquartered at Rheindahlen, stood at 4 armoured divisions with a peacetime strength of around 55,000 men through the 1970s. RAF Germany, headquartered at Rheindahlen alongside BAOR, operated Canberra, then Buccaneer, then Jaguar and Tornado squadrons from Bruggen, Wildenrath, Larbruck and Gütersloh. The Royal Navy provided the Eastern Atlantic Anti-Submarine Force based on Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft from Kinloss and St. Morgan, and on the Type 22 and Type 42 frigates and destroyers. The 1975 Defense Review under Roy Mason cut further. The Mediterranean commitment was ended. The commando ship HMS Bulwark was decommissioned. Simonstown was closed. The 1981 Defense Review, John Nott's paper of June 25, 1981, went further still. The surface fleet was to be reduced from 59 destroyers and frigates to about 50. 2 Invincible-class carriers were to be sold. HMS Invincible was to go to Australia. The ice patrol ship HMS Endurance, the only Royal Navy presence in the South Atlantic, was to be withdrawn. The Argentine junta, reading the Nott Review through their embassy in London, drew the conclusion that Britain was signalling the end of its commitment to the Falkland Islands. The invasion of April 2, 1982 followed. Nott offered his resignation. Thatcher refused it. The paradox was that the fleet Nott had proposed to cut was the fleet that recovered the islands, at a cost of 255 British dead, 775 wounded, 6 ships sunk, and a further 10 damaged. The Invincible sail was cancelled. The Type 22 program was extended. Endurance was reprieved. The lesson drawn in Whitehall was that a defence posture cut to the bone had no margin for the wars nobody had predicted. That lesson lasted about 5 years. By 1990, the options for change review under Tom King was cutting again, on the assumption that the Warsaw Pact was finished. The assumption was correct. The Warsaw Pact was formally dissolved on July 1, 1991. The Soviet Union was gone by December 26, 1991. Field Marshal Sir Nigel Bagnall, Chief of the General Staff from 1985 to 1988, had spent his career preparing the British Army of the Rhine for the war on the North German plain that never came. His operational concept, published in 1985, proposed manoeuvre warfare with counterstroke by the 2 British armoured divisions against a Soviet Third Shock Army breakthrough. The doctrine was tested in Exercise Lionheart in September 1984, the largest deployment of British forces to Germany since the Second World War. 131,500 troops, 22,000 vehicles, exercising the reinforcement plan for a war in Central Europe. It worked. The war it was designed for did not come. What did come was the Cold War's slow, unglamorous end, and the intelligence services had a great deal to do with how it arrived. Oleg Gordievsky was appointed KGB resident designate at the Soviet embassy in London in 1982. He had been reporting to the Secret Intelligence Service since 1974, initially through Copenhagen, latterly through the London station. His MI6 case officer through much of the London period was known within the service as Jack. Gordievsky's product went directly to the JIC and, through the JIC chairman Sir Anthony Duff, and later Sir Percy Craddock, to the Prime Minister. His most consequential report concerned Operation Ryan, the KGB and GRU joint intelligence effort, ordered by Yuri Andropov in May 1981 to detect signs of Western preparation for a nuclear first strike. Gordievsky reported that the Soviet leadership genuinely believed such a strike might be imminent. The intelligence was received in London with initial skepticism. Craddock, then chairman of the JIC, ordered a review. The review concluded that Gordievsky was correct. Moscow was not bluffing. In November 1983, NATO conducted Exercise Able Archer 83, a command post exercise that simulated the release procedures for nuclear weapons. Gordievsky reported through his handler that the Soviet General Staff had placed a portion of the Warsaw Pact air forces on alert in response, and that the fear in Moscow was real. The report was passed to Thatcher through Charles Powell on November 8th or 9th. Thatcher spoke by telephone to Reagan. The exercise was allowed to complete, but the more provocative elements planned for later phases were quietly dropped. Gordievsky was recalled to Moscow in May 1985 under suspicion, interrogated and released without charge. On July 20th, 1985, he was exfiltrated from Moscow across the Finnish border in the boot of a car driven by an SIS officer under diplomatic cover. The operation codenamed PIMLICO had been rehearsed in Moscow for 7 years by successive SIS station chiefs against the possibility that Gordievsky would need to run. When it came, it worked. His debriefing, conducted at a safe house in the home counties over the following months, gave Craddock and the JIC the most detailed picture of Soviet strategic thinking that had ever been available to a Western government. Thatcher used it in her preparations for the December 1984 Chequers seminar, at which she had assessed Mikhail Gorbachev, then a Politburo candidate, as a man she could do business with. She used it again in her meetings with Gorbachev at Downing Street in April 1989 and at successive summits. GCHQ at Cheltenham, under the directors Sir Brian Tovey and then Sir Peter Marychurch, provided the signals intelligence that complemented the human material. The UK-USA agreement of March 5, 1946, which had bound Britain and the United States into a single signals intelligence enterprise, meant that the product flowed both ways. British stations at Chiksans, Bude and Ios Nikolaos in Cyprus intercepted Soviet military and diplomatic traffic that was processed at Cheltenham and shared with the National Security Agency at Fort Meade. The betrayal of Jeffrey Prime, a GCHQ Russian linguist, arrested in April 1982 and convicted in November 1982 for passing material to the KGB from 1968 to 1977, was a serious wound to the service. Prime received a 35-year sentence. The damage assessment, conducted internally at Cheltenham and reviewed by the Security Commission, concluded that Prime had compromised specific decryption capabilities but not the underlying UK-USA relationship. The relationship survived. It went on surviving after the target had gone. The end came in Whitehall as a series of memoranda rather than a moment. The Berlin Wall was opened on the evening of November 9th, 1989. The British ambassador in East Berlin, Sir Nigel Broomfield, sent a cable to the Foreign Office reporting the scene at the Bornholmer Strasse crossing. Douglas Hurd, who had succeeded John Major as Foreign Secretary the previous month, read it the following morning. The Foreign Office had been reporting on Erich Honecker's deteriorating position since the summer. The collapse, when it came, was more sudden than predicted, but the direction had been understood. Thatcher was more cautious about German reunification than Bush or Kohl. Her Chequers seminar of March 24, 1990, at which academics including Hugh Trevor Roper, Norman Stone and Fritz Stern discussed the German character with the Prime Minister, produced a leaked minute by her private secretary Charles Powell that listed German national characteristics as she had absorbed them: angst, aggressiveness, assertiveness, bullying, egotism, inferiority complex, sentimentality. The minute, published in The Independent on Sunday on July 15, 1990, caused a diplomatic incident. Nicholas Ridley resigned as Trade and Industry Secretary the same week over a separate interview in The Spectator in which he had described monetary union as a German racket. Thatcher's own reservations about reunification were widely reported and not denied. She was overruled. The 2+4 talks in Moscow concluded on September 12, 1990, with the treaty that permitted German reunification on October 3, 1990. Thatcher was out of Downing Street by the end of November, replaced by John Major on November 28, 1990, after the leadership contest triggered by Geoffrey Howe's resignation speech on November 13th. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved at a meeting in Prague on July 1, 1991. The Soviet Union followed on December 26, 1991, when Gorbachev resigned and the flag over the Kremlin was lowered. The Chief of the Defence Staff, Field Marshal Sir Richard Vincent, was briefed at the MOD on December 27th. The papers went to Major at Downing Street the same afternoon. The Options for Change review, published on July 25, 1990 by Tom King, had already assumed this outcome. The British Army of the Rhine, which had stood at 55,000 troops in 1989, was to be reduced to a single armoured division of 23,000 by 1995. RAF Germany was to be reduced from 12 squadrons to 4. The Royal Navy's escort force was to fall to about 40 ships. The Vulcans were long gone. XH-558, the last airworthy example, had been sold to civilian ownership in 1993 after a period as the RAF display aircraft. She flew again from 2007 to 2015 in private hands, funded by public subscription, and was retired for the second and final time in October 2015. She sits now at Robin Hood Doncaster Sheffield Airport, on the runway from which the coal trains once ran. The doctrine that put her in the air, the doctrine of an independent British nuclear deterrent capable of imposing unacceptable damage on the Soviet Union without American permission, outlived her. Trident on Vanguard-class submarines from Faslane replaced Polaris from 1994. 4 boats, at least one at sea at all times, continuous at-sea deterrence, maintained without a break since April 1969. The Americans stopped laughing about the aluminium overcast in 1974. The reason they stopped had less to do with the aircraft than with the country that flew it, which was in the habit of doing what it said it would do, even when the doctrine had changed underneath it.